Welcome. This is a meeting for homeschoolers, and specifically Asian American homeschoolers, to meet the authors of the wonderful children's book, Two Faces, written by the wonderful Nina Wolpe here, my mother-in-law, and Gordon Nagai, her best friend. My name is Aideen. I'm Irish. I live in America now, and I've been really excited to help my mom share this book because it is a phenomenal book. But we would not be here at all if we hadn't met with Lucinda. Lucinda, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and explain why you were excited to have this Zoom get together.
My name is Lucinda Shu. I'm here in San Diego. I moderate Asian American Homeschoolers, a collaborative community. And Asian American homeschooling has grown about 8 times as of last year since before 2020. And so it's a growing population. This is also AAPI month. I really was excited to have a conversation with Gordon and Nina because these stories and these conversations need to be had before this generation is no longer with us. And I have had the privilege of serving in an Asian American church with Japanese roots when I was in my 20s and early 30s. I no longer live in that area, but I've done a lot of work around Asian American advocacy and in ministry in the church as well. I have a minor degree from UC Berkeley in Asian American Studies. And so that's the background at which I'm coming to this. And so the story of the Japanese internment is one that is often only told by Japanese voices, or it's told by a Western voice. It's very, very rare, especially with a book that's oriented for tweens and teens, as well as adults. It's very accessible. It's told in a story format, and this dialogue never really happens in literature. And so I finished reading it. It's I can't describe it other than to say it's poignant. It will make your heart break, but it's told in a very sensitive way.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. We're so glad to be here. And I'm so glad that Nina and Gordon decided to write this story together, as you said, to show the contrast between the journey of children during the Second World War. I'd love to invite Gordon to tell us a little bit about that story and give the people who maybe haven't read the book a context for what happened to you and why you decided to write the book. You'll just need to unmute. Gordon, you'll need to unmute first. We can't hear you. So just unmute when you could get a chance, please.
Gordon, take your mouse, hover over the right-hand corner of your screen.
You hear me now?
There,
Yeah.
yes.
I know where that icon is. I didn't realize that I was muted too. Okay, let me start over again. Nina contacted me in 2013 and had this real crazy idea that she had of writing our life stories during World War II. She was aware of my family's being interned during the war, and being a teacher, she was aware at the time that this story is essentially not told in public education. So this was her idea initially, to basically share my story. We decided to include her story as well, though, because while her story is probably familiar to most Americans. Many Americans experienced the same thing that her family did. But the interweaving of our two stories, we thought would be a unique way to tell the story. So that's how we started. Nina and I actually know each other from when we were, I think it was juniors in high school. This would have been in 1955. We were both in the Methodist Youth Fellowship, which is a youth organization with the Methodist Church. She was in Merced and I was in Livingston. And somehow there was a joint meeting and the two of us struck it off almost immediately. And I think the thing that attracted us to each other was that we were both on a religious quest to understand what the meaning of religion was and was it important in today's life. And we thought very much alike and our thinking just clicked. And so that's how it all started. We stayed in touch throughout high school, maintained contact during our college years. And then afterwards, we still had some contacts, even though our family lives really went quite divergently in different directions. But when she contacted me in 2013, it was essentially as though we had maintained our relationship solidly throughout that whole time. So that was the beginning of our story.
Gordon, we're aware that you guys met actually later during your teenage years. Can you talk a little bit about how, you decided to change the story and fictionalize it slightly in order to serve that story better?
Sure. Actually, the story elements that are told in Two Faces essentially are true life experiences that Nina and I both had during the war. We were actually 4 years old at the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And our initial editor recommended that we age ourselves from age 4 to age 10 so that we would be older, we would have more life experiences, we would be better able to mentally deal with the issues of family and prejudice and the whole separation that came between the two of us with my family going into the internment camp. So while the story itself is told from using the voices of 10-year-olds, in reality, we were 4 years old at the beginning. But the decision to age ourselves was in order to make the story more believable and more realistic. And again, the experiences were real to life. They are experiences that we had, but we chose to speak in the voice of 10-year-olds.
That's wonderful. Nina, would you like to tell us the background from your perspective?
I was teaching in Okinawa and Japan, mainland Japan, with the Department of Defense. I taught on the bases, for the military bases, for the schools there. And with the experience of being in Japan for all those years, I was there for about 9 years in Japan and 7 in Okinawa. This time in Gordon's and my life kept coming up and kept reminding me of, where I was, kept reminding me of the relationship to people back in the States during the time of the war and the way the American military leadership and Roosevelt let this happen, let all these hundreds of thousands of people go to camps, concentration camps, with the concepts that, we're going to protect them, or they're spies and we need to lock them away, keep them away from the coastlines. And so Gordon's family and all these families from California and Oregon were moved into Central America. And it just kept coming up to me that something, was really very, very wrong and broken about doing that. So as we got to writing the book together and dealing with these, in the book, we decided, okay, we will write letters to each other, that he's going to be in a camp in Colorado and I'm going to be in California, and we're going to miss each other. So we're going to just keep writing letters to each other and keep each other in contact and help in any way we can with anything that the two of us needed. And it was just such a wonderful way to tell this story of what was going on in America in true life, but in our book. So most of our book is based on true events and activities in our lives. We were told by our sisters or older people in the family, our grandparents, we were told things, and we certainly had some memories by the time we were 7 when the war was closing down. We certainly did remember what was going on in our lives at that time. So it was just an amazing chance that the two of us had to tell this true story about what was going on in America at that time. And I think we did a brilliant job with it. I think it's a wonderful telling of our stories. The one thing, though, that I've been doing recently is thinking, okay, we in America need to have children's books that are ethnically attached to either the story or the pictures. So what we're doing is taking the Black kid, the Asian kid, the whatever, and we are writing a story about that Blackness, that Asianness, that whatever, okay? Instead of just having a wonderful story for kids, a funny story, whatever, a fantasy or whatever, and it'd be a picture book, and there you'd have the pictures show a diversity. It doesn't have to be about the diversity in the story. It's just human beings, Americans, kids, adventuring and having stories and events in their lives, but not necessarily about the ethnicity of it, which is wonderful too. And that's what most of our stories now are about. They're dealing with the ethnicity. But our story does that. It does tell that, and it's a story about that. But we also need some books that are just everyday funny fantasy fairyland stories with the pictures being a mix of the diversity in America.
I'd love to invite Lucinda to come back. I know that you had some questions for Nina and Gordon.
I did want to pause and just say, I really resonate with what Nina said about literature. It is so important that children can see themselves in a story, in film, in our culture, in what's produced, so that they can dream those dreams, that it's not a dream that they're blocked from, that Black, white, yellow, brown, red faces, that they are all represented. And obviously, I'm coming at this as a Christian homeschooler. I see that as the tapestry of the fullness of who we are to be as people. And unless and until that we can do that, that becomes very hard. I actually came across a very powerful picture book that told a story I've never seen told before. It's actually entitled Watercress. And in that story, are you familiar with this picture book?
Yep.
Yes. I actually did that. I waded in the streams in California with my parents. I thought it was extremely weird. Why are we pulling off to the side of the road? But it told that story. It also told the story of what their lives were like in China. And it was exactly like my family's story. And when we can tell these stories and see what we don't see, that's when it becomes powerful and lives beyond ourselves, right? And I am so privileged to be here with you. I really thank you for your time. I know that that's a big ask, what we have asked you to do today. And so I completely want to respect that, and just wanted to say thank you on behalf of everyone you will never actually talk to who will see this later. But
Our pleasure to be a part of this.
so I actually grew up near a military base in California, Travis Air Force Base. And I met a lot of families actually who did serve in Okinawa because the US has bases there. And so I'm very familiar with that life as well. And where I grew up is very much where you guys grew up. My town was agricultural. I graduated from a class of 861. I was the only full Asian there. There were a handful who were mixed because they were military families. And then we had some exchange students. I remember having to communicate with Japanese exchange students and take them around, and they simply assumed that I could communicate with them because I look like them, but I don't. I speak Chinese, and specifically Cantonese. And so I do have questions for you, if it's okay. And
Lucinda, before you go on, say again where you lived.
I grew up outside of Travis Air Force Base. I don't want to say where I really from because this is recorded, you know. But Travis Air Force Base is located halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento. So I remember growing up, it was very agricultural, seeing truckloads of tomatoes go by, the smell of onions in the air from the processing plant. I think Heinz or Hunt's had a processing plant for tomatoes. So in the summer, I know exactly what you mean when you say it is hot. People do not understand what hot means unless you live in the valley in California, and it's just a heavy hot, but at least it's a dry heat. That's all I can say. But I grew up working in my family's kitchen in a restaurant. I was bussing tables and running the commercial dishwasher in a kitchen that didn't have air conditioning all through the summer. I was 8 years old standing on milk crates. And yes. So that's the story of my family, but that's not about me. But I think what I wanted to ask you as children, what was your granted, I think by the time we come to the end of World War II, in your real lives, you guys are probably what, 8, 9?
Yes.
Right? Am I correct? Somewhere around there? What was your understanding, or as you talk to your siblings or other people who were at that age and the timing of the characters in this story, your understanding of war? Because we live in a time now where war is very present. It lives with us 24/7 through cable television. We see war everywhere. And that's very different than the time that you described, where there is physical distance, right? And so I was curious, did children have a sense of what was happening in Europe at this time prior to Pearl Harbor?
Gordon, would you like to go first?
Sure. Being 4 years old, I knew very little about or anything about Pearl Harbor at all. My parents did not talk about it. I think they were basically destroyed by that whole experience that Japan would do that. So that was never brought up at home before we left for camp. While we were in camp, and I think probably most parents with young children did this. My parents did not talk about the war at all. So I didn't hear about the war, especially the war in the Pacific, but even the war in Europe, I didn't hear about it. Now, I do remember my aunt every Sunday would read the Sunday paper, the comics, and she would read certain articles about where the U.S. Army was in the battle in Europe. So I did hear some things that were kind of sanitized in a way, the way she read it to us. So I got a little bit about what the war was, but I didn't really understand it. I knew that my uncle was in the war. He was a member of the 442nd. And I remember my aunt had in the window of her apartment the little white flag with the blue star in the middle of it that said that there was a member of that family that was serving in the military. So I was somewhat aware of it, but not really.
Now, when I was a child that age, when we heard the radio announcement of the attack, yeah, my dad and his best friend immediately that very moment got on the telephone with each other, and they agreed to meet downtown. And they agreed that they were both going to go volunteer to serve in the military, which they did. And so my background from 4, 5, 6, 7 was to be worried about my dad through all those years, because he was assigned to the Army Air Corps in England in the southeast corner at an airport that had been militarized, with the military airplanes going and coming over Germany and over Italy. And so my mother, of course, was very worried about him, and we had to leave our house and we had to give away our dog. And this is all part of our book. These are how Gordon and I did chapters of what I was going through and what he was going through. And we did that through the whole book and writing in our letters in this. And so what I knew of World War II was pretty close to me as it related to my dad serving and being moved from our house and live with my grandfather and some aunts. And they, of course, talked about it all the time. And as Gordon said, there were those little flaggy things in the windows of the homes along the street where we lived. And we were so worried, about his safety. And so that comes through as sort of my side of the story in the book about my dad. And in the end, he came home and asked my mom for a divorce. He had met a woman, and this was more my relationship to my side of the war. I was a home front child, but I also was very affected by what had happened to my precious family. But Gordon and I talked about this through the book, what the two of us were going through. So, yeah,
So
by the
this
time we were
actually-
both 7, we had a very strong idea about what had happened and how wrong it was to send people away to camps that were Americans living in America, even the infants, even the orphanage in San Francisco. Those Japanese children, those Japanese American children were taken from the orphanage and put into a camp. Not, spies at age 2 months, It's just impossible, So it was a heartbreaking time for both of
Yeah.
us. Yeah, but we came from different angles on the war experience.
So as you were, this actually segues into another question that I have is, as an Asian American, when 9/11 happened and we saw a similar response as to what you recounted about your father,
Mhm,
a call to arms, a
mhm.
lot of people immediately volunteering
Oh,
to serve in the military. And we watched as Asian Americans what felt like, and in a lot of ways repeated in since then, the response to people of Middle Eastern descent. And tangentially, it was affecting Asian Indians as well. And also, we saw this also play out recently since 2020 in how people have reacted to people of Asian descent with COVID.
Yes.
And it feels like, from someone who is Asian American, that we see these things playing out repeatedly.
Again.
And I don't know from both of your point of view, looking back on life, what do you see that we have learned or not learned, or continue to struggle with as a country or the community of people?
Gordon, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think in some ways we have learned quite a bit, just in terms of racial issues around conflict. But on the other side, I think we also have not learned a whole lot, because we keep seeming to make the same mistakes again and again. After 9/11, there was talk about setting up internment camps for Arab Americans, Arab and Arab American citizens. The same talk was happening at that time, and it struck me that in a way we had not learned a whole lot. And then during the previous administration, prior to the current one, our civil servants on the southern border separated children from the families and put them in what essentially were internment camps behind barbed wire. And that was just a graphic experience that wasn't that long ago. It was just 4 or 5 years back in time. And this was even more heinous in my mind, because we separated children from their families, and with no real plan to reunite them at any time in the future.
It's just so hard. I feel like America has this wonderful democracy concept, ideology, and we do climb the mountain. We try to climb the mountain to make it equal and make it peaceful. But all through the years, we've slipped back down with different ethnic groups, that gets zeroed in on and hurt and removed and separated. And you'd think that we would all, we'd be so much better at it now as a democracy and as a concept, that the equality would be stronger and the diversity would be fun. You should enjoy all the fun of people and what they do and their experiences and their skills. It's really sad to me when right now we just slide back into hating each other and using such horrible language to hurt each other. And who knows whether we'll slip into something even worse with this next election coming. But I think this book needs to be in schools. These children haven't lived this. They haven't been like this in our generation, or in our time now. That's not true. A lot of them have. So it's important that books like this come out to reveal the true history.
Yeah, I do think like one of the things that I find that history isn't as emphasized in our culture,
in our schools.
And sometimes I see conversations around what's happening that it's as if it's new. And most of the time, I think you guys would agree, it's actually not new. We've seen this before. We just failed to tell the stories.
Yes.
It actually brings me to another question that I had is how you see the stories of children being told in the context of conflict. When I look out into the world and I see what's happening in Ukraine and I see what's happening in Gaza, and without getting into the politics of any of that, I think we can all agree that children pay the highest price.
Yes.
And they carry the psychic harm and the moral injury and the trauma of that. And so can you talk about, if you feel comfortable, about, for each of you grew up during a time where that actually happened to you and the reverberations of that, especially in the Japanese community, that has carried on and continues to carry on that that total generational trauma of that, as well as with the war. As a home front child, that is a very real thing that also happened.
I think that Gordon's family did a brilliant job of keeping it as normal and peaceful each day as they could. I mean, they just really, I was impressed as I read through Gordon's chapters and the experiences he had with that need for the kids to feel safe and to know about love and family. That comes through, I think, in our book very strongly. They were very strong and very wise.
I think that was part of the goal that I had, was to
Mhm.
talk about what happened in my family and the role my parents both played in keeping all of us kids safe and feeling secure and basically feeling normal. Now, when we got back from camp, this was February of 1945, so it was before the war ended in Europe or in the Pacific. The thing that I learned many, many years later was the superintendent of the school in Atwater pulled together his whole staff. So this included teachers, secretaries, janitors, bus drivers, anyone who worked in the school, and particularly the teachers, since they would be the ones dealing directly with the students. There were 4 of us Japanese kids in the school. The superintendent made a plea that all staff ensure the safety of these 4 kids, to protect us from being bullied or being called names and things like that. And that's in fact what happened. My experience from 1st grade through 8th grade was in some ways idyllic, because I had many, many friends. I have no memory of any experience of being called names. There are friends that I have who lived in other communities where their lives were just totally horrendous because of the abuse that they received from other kids. My life was really much different. And it was because the leadership of the school district decided they were going to protect the 4 of us kids. And that's what they did.
I'm
think
going to
my-
share a little anecdote with you about a story from my own childhood. I think I referred to, I don't think we teach history well. This was when I was in 7th grade. No, wait. My sister was in 7th grade. I was in 8th grade. We were walking to school. We walked together to our middle school every morning. I did not know it was Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. As we were walking to school, there were boys across the street from us, and they started pelting us with rocks and clods of dirt. And I didn't understand why. And they were yelling, "Jap, go home," and then doing whatever they were trying to imitate, you know what I mean, about Asian languages. And my sister and I had no idea why this was happening, because we didn't know about Pearl Harbor. We hadn't learned about World War II. Had I had this book at that time, because I read everything in my library, that's the only thing that had accessible to me. But I didn't understand until many, many years later when I was at Berkeley and I took Asian American Studies, that I understood why this mattered. But I carried that. I never spoke about that, never told my parents this ever happened to me, never told my school administrators this happened to me. We carried it. Obviously, I'm still talking about it to this day. And I actually don't think I've talked about it in public like this. And I know it's going to go out to everyone, but the sins of the past continued to be experienced in the future. And so in that, like, I resonate with your friends and their experiences, because even I experienced that many, many years later. I won't say what year this was, but when I look back at my child self, see, I was 12 years old, 13 years old, maybe at that time. And just being confused about that and not having any other Asian faces to ask that question, because I grew up in a town where, people didn't go to college. 10% of my graduating class went on to university. But having to walk through a lot of racism in my past, I actually graduated at the top of my class and won a lot of awards that year. And I got so much hate that I took something away from other people that were American and deserved that. So that's why I wanted to say, this is why this matters. I hope people understand why I believe strongly it matters for us to talk about this.
Well,
for
and how
children.
long it took for us as a nation to tell the truth about what happened and
Yes.
apologize to all those families. That was what, Gordon, 40 years before anything was starting to be said about how wrong we were, what we did during that, what we did in America during those war years.
I wanted to highlight something that a lot of people may not be aware of during that time. In 1942, the U.S. War Department published a pocket guide to China. And in this pocket guide, there was a comic book section entitled How to Spot a Jap.
Oh, jeez.
And this pamphlet actually was instructive to soldiers, because they were, being airdropped. And remember, they were headed into China. And also here in the United States, it got republished in media. But this whole idea of pitting Chinese versus Japanese, and that reverberates into the Asian American community, because that created such division. I remember when in my studies of Chinese American history, seeing this play out and seeing like distancing between Chinese and Japanese, and that continued to cause fissures later, especially like when the JACL started. That was not, I would say, universally welcomed in communities, because, as Gordon and I both come from backgrounds like this, there's a phrase that shows up over and over again in your book, and probably might butcher the Japanese, but shikata gane, silence, that you're supposed to be silent, it cannot be helped. And there's a culture of silence that is emphasized both in Japanese and in Korean and in Chinese, as well as other Asian cultures, that you must swallow your bitterness, you must be silent, you must just endure. We're a culture of endurance. And so the thought is, if you just endure, you will survive this. And then this idea of all of a sudden the Japanese American Citizens League comes out, it emerges, causes a lot of waves, because it's using voices like you're supposed to in a democracy, but we come from very cultural backgrounds, which are very community group oriented, where the individual is not allowed to speak. And so can you talk about that, Gordon, what that was like for you and your family and your community, to see what the JACL was doing and how hard they fought over many decades to get reparations?
Yeah, the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, has a mixed history. For a long time, the JACL basically sided with the government and encouraged everyone to accept the internment, that this would be a way to show our true patriotism. it grated really strongly with a big segment of the people in the camps. My parents were on the side of accepting what was going on. As you say, it's like shkataganai, it can't be helped. So don't do anything about it. My parents were 200% American citizens. My mother was born here, so she was actually an American citizen. My father came as an immigrant alien, but he adopted this country as his own. So the two of them were 200% American, and they basically supported the JECL in its efforts. My mother, I think, understood that her constitutional rights were taken away by all of this action. But again, she was being a good Japanese as well as being a good American by accepting the government and not questioning anything. Anyway, so I grew up with kind of a mixed understanding of what the JECL was. And as I became aware of kind of the split nature of the group, I still, I think, have a difficult time accepting the role that the JECL played during the war. I think there were some things that they did that were good in terms of standing up for Japanese Americans, but the dark side of what they did still changed my impression of what they did.
I think like your answer really highlights, I think, complexity, I think, and nuance when we look at any situation, rather things that are in the present as well. Very rarely are things so black and white that there's only two sides. There's really a multitude of things, and I feel like sometimes we've lost that ability as a people, as culture, due to how we communicate, that we talk past each other and we don't see all the different ways and perspectives. And so I really like what you said, because it is very mixed history if you really delve into it. And at times I hesitate to almost use this word, but there was some complicity in what happened to the community, but in other ways that they did push for some change. And it's like with everything, there's people are neither like wholly one way or the other. There's actually, good and bad aspects to what's happening. Now, one thing I want to go back to with the book that I thought you guys did an amazing job with is and this is how I work with my children, and when we see bad things in the world happening, and as children you feel very vulnerable around that, and you often have a very strong sense of moral justice, that why can't people just do the right thing? Why are people hurting each other? And it's very hard for most parents to explain why bad things happen. And what I've told my children is that I can't always tell you why, but I can tell you to look for the helpers. And when you find the helpers, you will find the people that you can go to, and that's who you can partner up with. And I love that you wrote, very early on, you used the phrase, the doers, right? That somebody was a doer. And then Mr. Kitagawa and Mrs. Snyder. I think I'm probably missing some along the way because I forgot to keep jotting it down. But that you pointed out that they chose to engage in what a lot of us would run away from, and to be there in the camps, to be there to teach, to do the little things that they could do to change in their small corner of the world. Because sometimes I think we discount the small actions that but if you guys
Planting the
want to share
trees.
about
Mhm.
why you chose to write about doers and these particular people, and I get the sense these were real people.
Yes, they were. There was one man who in the camp, I described him, David Nakagawa. He was a high official in the National YMCA. And he came out with some of them, excuse me, with some of the men against the draft for the Japanese Americans in the camps. There was a group of Japanese American men who were not opposed to the draft. They were willing to serve in the military, but they wanted to have everyone's constitutional rights returned to them and everyone sent back home. And once that was done, they were willing to serve in the military. So they were patriotic, but they were demanding that the government own up to its constitutional responsibilities. Well, David was one of those men that stood up against the government. And he was in the story that I share in the book, he was afraid that he was going to be sent away. And he, in fact, was sent to Tule Lake. But he was one of the people that I consider the doers. He stood on principle, and he also stood as a patriot of the government, of the country, and was willing to serve if constitutional protections were returned to him. But I think there were several of those individuals that we sprinkled throughout the story that helped to convey the idea of the doers, the people that stood on principle and tried to do the right thing.
Lucinda, may I ask you a question? What kind of materials, books, research sources do you use in the homeschooling experience for the children that are in your homeschooling group that you have here today?
Oh, that's a very loaded question. It's quite extensive. I think you guys saw one bookcase I have like 5. My house is filled with books.
Okay. Do you do a lot
but
on this subject on World War II books and
there
experiences?
is one there's a few that have come out
Yeah.
for those who are trying to teach around Asian American or Asian heritage.
Okay.
And I'll list them. There's a new curriculum called Streams. It teaches Chinese American history.
Okay.
I really hope that maybe a Japanese American will actually come out with that. I studied at Berkeley an author, Ron Takaki. He wrote Strangers from a Different Shore, but there's also another book. There's a young people's version. Why am I blanking? A Different Mirror. That is excellent. I used the college version of the text in school, but there is one written that's been adapted for young people, and that tends to be used now in ethnic studies or Asian American studies classes that are offered at middle school and high school levels in the public school. Here in California, there actually is a new requirement in the education system that every student must take an ethnic studies course. This might sound a little controversial. There's another book, probably because he's more left-leaning. Howard Zinn wrote a book, a 2-volume series, A Young People's History. And in it, he tells the untold story of different historical events. And so history is told from the victors. That's the story that we all learn. Like, for example, in Japan, you will not hear Japanese students taught about World War II the way you would be taught about it here. In China, students don't know about Tiananmen Square. So you see, like it's culturally you curate to whatever the dominant culture want the messaging. And so
It's like it's like our Florida banning
yes,
so many of these kinds of books.
yes. So I actually do want to make, I'll add a resource for people. Anybody who's running into where they live a ban on books, the New York Public Library system has made their library available to anybody anywhere. And so you have
Yes.
access to all of their digital collections. So access to books is completely open. What I have done with Asian American homeschoolers, for many, many years, I kept saying, why isn't there an Asian American homeschool Facebook group? And then it dawned on me that, well, if it's not there, then maybe I'm supposed to build it. And so it started off very small. And I think we are over 200 people now.
Wow.
And I'm just now starting to do conversations like this, thinking about, okay, where am I supposed to go with this? Because there's no plan. But what I would also say is there is a whole collection of literature around this, biographies, and many things told through story. At some point, when I get a chance, I will probably put together a book list. I've wanted very much to teach a class for homeschoolers. I can't at this point. I'm not sure if I ever am going to be able to, given my current medical challenges. But what it is I am actively trying to find someone to do this because there was a really amazing class done through a group called Online G3. It's for accelerated learners. They meet the needs of homeschoolers. They did a Latin American history course called Blood and Fire. Amazing course. My son currently just finished their multi-ethnic literature class. And so there are these little pockets of resources. Please feel free to join Asian American homeschoolers. We freely share about things we cannot talk about in mainstream groups. The way we talk about these things and the transparency, it would be taken the wrong way a lot of times. And so we can have these conversations, understanding the perspective without having to explain. Because too often, people like me, like some who are listening, like Gordon, we have to have this dual way of engaging with culture. We constantly we code speak, we code switch. And so we talk to people depending on the context. And so how openly I'm talking about this is because of this particular context. I would not engage in things this way because I try to understand where someone's coming from and engage them that way. There's a very excellent book written by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. If you're not familiar with it, it's called The Righteous Mind, how the left and the right, it's about how the left and the right can't communicate with each other, and he talks about how we can engage in conversations in a more productive way. And so that's very powerful because we learn to understand, when we learn to see things from another person's perspective, and then we engage them in ways that are accessible for them, where we don't violate what he calls their sacred pillars, or a lot of times things that I guess you could call them, we inadvertently step on other people when we use vocabulary that means something in that context, that means something completely different to you. And so, like, for example, Gordon and I probably have gotten this question, which seems innocuous from a Western point of view. Where are you really from? Right?
Yeah. Yes.
And then I'll say, well, I'm from, Central California. And they'll say, no, where are you really from? And I would say, Aideen, you probably have not really gotten that question the way we do. That's not what they mean by that. Because they're implicit in that statement is you don't belong here. You must be other, right? And so there's another amazing resource that I would like to point out from my university, Berkeley. It's called Othering and Belonging Institute. Completely free resources, lots of webinars, classes, training, but it's talking about creating spaces where we don't other people and we create belonging spaces. And what does that look like? And what does that mean? And how do we need to rethink how we create spaces? And so some of it's about accessibility. Some of it's about the language we use, the context in which we approach things. Like, for example, like this particular space, we're holding it in the middle of the day. That means implicitly it's not going to be accessible for anybody who actually works during the workday. And so by making a recording available, we are enabling that to be accessible. Now, there might be people who are hearing challenged and or have sensory processing issues. Because you're going to put it on YouTube, there is the option of it being closed captioning. And then also with YouTube, I'm pretty sure you can enable some language translation. So people can receive this in the language that is accessible to them. And so there's all these tools we have now that are amazing. We live in an amazing time that's both amazing and sometimes alarming things that we are engaged with. Does that answer your question? Because sometimes I can go off on a bunny trail.
Yeah.
But I will offer more webinars in the context of Asian American homeschoolers to address some of these things. But one thing this does lead me to is another question that I had is how do you think things would have been different around the Japanese internment and what happened in World War II had that generation had access to communicate the way we can today in instantaneously time across boundaries of culture, geography, political, using email, social media, live casting, YouTube. There's so many tools we have. What do you think would have been different?
I don't think it's so different. I think we really have a very confusing time right now with anger and hatred and they with the political scene, and it just seems really sad and broken to me. And we have to work very hard to get democracy back in place and some equality back in place.
I think it would have been a little different than what happened in 42. If the entire Japanese community on the West Coast today were told that they were going to be interned and moved away from the coast, I think there would be a major rebellion and serious opposition. First of all, I think a greater part of that population is well aware of constitutional issues and I think have moved on beyond the traditional Japanese "kataganai, it can't be helped" kind of mentality. And I think the greater portion who are, and probably most of them now are Japanese Americans of Japanese descent. I think they would now take a stand on constitutional issues, and I think the government would have their hands really full of some pretty angry people. I think that would be a major difference from 42.
One of the things that I think as I reflect back, there was an exercise that we engaged in at my church in the East Bay. And wow, I want to say this happened in the 90s. I remember that the leadership, by that time we had transformed to become an Asian American church from our Japanese roots. And I think I told you guys about this before we came on. So I think, or Adine, you two wanted me to tell this story. So the church that I'm from, that I served on, during the years of World War II and with the Japanese internment, and when people had to leave their homes, many Japanese families had to abandon all their possessions because you could only take what you could carry in those suitcases. And so for a lot of people, what they watched happen was essentially a fire sale of their possessions, their prized belongings. Now, in my church, they lived in a neighborhood in West Berkeley. And what the neighbors did was they protected them. All the families moved all their belongings into the church. The whole church just became one giant storage facility. And the neighborhood made sure it wasn't vandalized and it was protected and it was there when they came back. But that was, I think, more the exception. Gordon's experience with his family, the neighbors doing that. I've read so many stories and heard so many stories of neighbors offering to do that, but essentially they took it. They kept the properties in their name. When they came back, it was no longer there. And so I'm not always sure exactly what the proportion was, but that was a very meaningful thing. We continued on in that area, but the demographics of that area changed. And our church made a very deliberate decision to leave West Berkeley because we essentially became a commuter church. We're in suburban communities coming into Berkeley. And that church was idle and empty during the week. Nobody went there. And that's not what a church is meant to be. And that neighborhood had become very African-American in demographic. And so we chose to sell it at a very low price to a African-American church that needed a home. And now that church does what we could not do, which is to create programs for the children in that community. It has now become a hub. And so I think recognizing how we can come side by side to meet needs from different groups is really important. Our church has now found a new home in the Oakland Hills after being church homeless for about and renting for about, gosh, I think that's about 25 years we did that. But it was a dying church in Oakland. Most of the people, their families had moved away. And so this congregation had essentially shrunk down so small that they were going to close down this church, but they could have sold it. It was amazing property. If you guys knew where it was, you're like, oh, that's prime property in the Oakland Hills. Very expensive, but they looked for a church that needed that. And so now what we did, 25 years earlier for another church has been done again for this church. And so now it's a vibrant, and that's where some of our families do live, in that area of Oakland, not in West Berkeley, but in the Oakland Hills. And so now we see this repeating. And I think the more that we can model that and we can do that, we had to go through a very deep time of healing because most of the church leadership was no longer Japanese and actually was Chinese. And we had a very long retreat with the leadership where we came together and we talked through some of the things that had happened between Japanese and Chinese communities. And we had time where we asked for forgiveness and we talked. And I have never, and Gordon probably understands this, I have never seen Issei and Nisei cry like that. And it was very healing because I could see like generational anger over silence in the Asian American community from other, in the Chinese community over the Chinese Exclusion Act, the hurt and bitterness over the silence when we watched this happen, you know, what happened to the Japanese community. And we watched this successively happen over, it plays out in many ways, but seeing how we need to, how it's hard to let go of those things, but you have to let go of those things to move forward and to build something new, right?
Definitely. I'd love to, because we only have about 10 or 15 minutes left, I'd love to ask anybody who's watching as a participant if they also have any questions. You can either put something in the chat to ask a question, or you can come on camera if you'd like. But it's been a very powerful meeting, it feels like, and we really hope that this book will reach Asian Americans of all backgrounds, and that more of these cultural stories will come and to be understood and known and honored, you know, for the times that that people went through. So if anybody has a question, you can put your hand up or unmute yourself and ask a question. And if there are no questions, then Lucinda, did you have any other last questions?
Yeah, I actually had pages of questions. I'm gonna come to this question. At the end of the book, Nina writes about her dreams. And this is in a conversation with Carlos. And she talks about her dream for lives to be fun and happy and full of knowing. This is children's lives that I'm referring to, of exploring, of building a kind and generous and peaceful world. And so, do you want to talk about more of that? Because I know that sometimes a lot of people are hesitant to offer a book like this to their children because it is a heavy topic. It opens up a lot of things you have to talk about. And I did want to bring people to the end and how you and Gordon kind of want to tie this in.
I spoke recently with a group of children who were in a school right here in this neighborhood. And just hearing them responding to things like you were just describing, they just seem so mature and so touched by how to do that and doing it and being involved. And they wrote some wonderful things about the book too, you know, to be put on the back of the book and inside the book. They just really, to me, surprised me by the maturity of the feelings and the questions that they had about the very thing you're talking about. How do we change this so that it's better and different and kinder world, you know? I was really impressed by how they had been touched by this and were really thoughtful about the responses to it. Yeah. I hope that it's going to trigger them to doing things as they get older.
Gordon, would you like to speak to that point of what you want the legacy of this book to be?
Sure. I think from the beginning, one of the things that Nina and I wanted the book to do was, and the reason that we put it in the voice of 10-year-olds was we wanted the story to be told not just a chronology of what happened, but how it affected two young children, what we thought, what we felt like, to make the story come alive, and not just a historical narrative about what happened. That was one of our main goals in sharing the story. And the response that we've gotten from school children indicates that we at least partially have met that goal, because it did speak to them. And the voice of two 10-year-olds did speak a language that they could understand and learn from.
I think you had asked me earlier about tools or resources. I wanted to just pause and give people these two particular resources. One is another book written by Jonathan Haidt. It's relatively new. It's called The Anxious Generation. And I really highly recommend this to parents and also adults to really understand how the role of media, social media, has changed how we engage in the world. And it's to Nina's point that we seem to be an angrier society, a less kind society, and to understand how that has actually affected us and changed how our brains are receiving information, how we react to other people. There's another documentary called, I believe it's called The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which goes on to talk about how social media has impacted people and how our thinking and how we communicate. And so if we can use tools like this to help our children, and they talk about how to combat that, what safeguards you can put, because you can't remove this. I know we want to go back to a world that's better than what it is now, but our world is what it is. And so if we can just look fully into that and then shape how we engage with that, right? And give our children tools, because essentially, like, what we're doing is we're handing our children the keys to this, but we aren't giving them the tools to how to engage, because I don't even think adults do that well. But the one last thing I would end with, at least for questions from me, is just coincidentally, my family will be going up to the Mammoth area. And so we will be making a trip to go to Manzanar. And Gordon, what would you tell me that you would like my children? I have a 7-year-old and a 15-year-old, and their cousins who are young adults and college students will be coming along as well, to take away from their trip to go to Manzanar. For those who don't know what Manzanar is one of the 10 internment camps. It's the one here in California. The other one is Tule Lake, which they refer to in this book. Camp Amachi, I think I pronounced it right, in Colorado is also a national park historic site. But they've since improved Manzanar. There's a film there. And then also, for those who don't know, there's actually a very old film called Farewell to Manzanar, which is quite good. And so if you want to help your children learn about this time, those are some resources that you can go to. But what would you advise me that you would want them to take away from that experience? And Nina, maybe like what you would want children to take away as someone who's not Asian, coming into this, not of Japanese.
I was just thinking, this may be a little bit different, but my husband was a politician for a lifetime. And his political philosophy was that politics, but you can put another word there, politics is just problem solving. And you come together, we work together on solving the problem. It's a we experience. It's not a divisive experience. You sit down together and you talk about the issue and you talk about the concern and you talk about all the different points of view. And when you vote, then that's accepted, for the most part, to be okay. And you go on to another problem to solve. It's not a divisive thing. It should be a come together thing for us to solve problems. And I would hope that kids in reading this book could see how Gordon and I helped each other. It was kind of problem solving, when he would write a letter about the things that were happening to him, and I had things at home that I would write about, but we still helped each other solve those problems. We weren't enemies. We weren't racist and ugly about how we were thinking the we-they thing. We worked together as us, as we, to try to take care of each other and help each other get through it. And I just hope that kids can learn how to do that together and not be just learning hate and learning divisiveness. I hope that it's important, that we have a we kind of philosophy going on in our society.
For me, in answer to your question, I believe at Manzanar, there's a restored barracks there. And I would hope that your children and your other family members would learn the specifics of how many people were actually at Manzanar in that very tiny space, and to experience being in one of those apartments. They're 20 by 25, something like that, that space. To imagine what a family of 5 would experience being in those 4 small walls. I don't know if there's a separate building for the mess hall and the bathrooms, but again, if there is one there, to experience the mass of people that would be eating at every meal,
Mhm.
and the open bathrooms without individual stalls, the open showers without individual stalls, and to experience, ask yourselves, have your kids ask themselves, how would they feel using the toilet and showering in the open like that, with anybody and everyone also doing the same thing. So coming away from just the physical experience of the closed space and the emptiness and the exposure, to have that experience.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody who's been here. Thank you so much to Lucinda. I think what that we've spoken about there in the final statements is all about, can you stand in someone else's shoes?
Mhm.
Can you see things from their perspective also?
Mhm.
And it's a
True.
lifelong
Mhm.
journey.
Mhm.
We're all, especially when we get upset or when we feel there's an injustice, it's very hard to also see things from more than one perspective. So thank you so much to Nina Wolpe and to Gordon Nagai for writing this amazing
It's
book.
Wonderful. to
And if you could take the book, I'll show everyone the cover here. When you see this book, it's available on Amazon, and the website is www.twofacesthebook.com. And we are open to running more events like this if anyone was interested. Lucinda has also invited anyone who is in homeschooling, especially with Asian American families, that they can join her Facebook group. So I will be putting the link for that with the description. And anything else, if anybody has a resource that they would like me to add to the description for this video that will hopefully reach many people, please let me know. So Lucinda, anything final words?
No, just tome affogato.
Thank you,
I have
Gordon.
one thought, Lucinda.
Yes.
If any of your students who were here today, or any that see the video later, if any of them have any questions, feel free to send those questions to us, and we'll respond to them.
If you are gladly would appreciate another opportunity to talk with you more in the future, maybe not specifically about this book, but I think your experiences would be something that I would love to come back and do one with just students who have since read it. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of students now who will read it, and so maybe we can look at doing that at some
That'd be wonderful.
future.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Look
thank you.
forward to that. Would love to do it.
Is
Thank
there
you.
anybody who's watching that would like to say some final words of thanks or any last question? In that case, thank you again. I'm Aideen, Nina's daughter-in-law. Thank you, Lucinda.
Stay
Thank
safe,
you,
everyone.
Gordon. And thank you, Nina. Just one thing coming up in the chat here. From Jen, this is a very powerful meeting. Thank you for hosting it. I look forward to continuing the learning in this subject in history. A list of resources mentioned in this meeting would be very helpful. And Marjorie, thank you for sharing your lives with us today. So thank you all for watching. We appreciate you so much. And arigato gozaimasu. And goodbye. And we hope to run something similar again soon.
I'll say it